As in my last talk that I was over in Salon A, we only have 50 minutes, so I mentioned before that I'm going to skip all the funny jokes and interesting stories that I could share to kind of win over the audience and make you guys connect with me. Instead, I got a better idea. Let's just all on the count of 3 laugh, okay? And we'll pretend that I said some joke, okay? And then we'll just kind of move on from there. Okay, so 1, 2, 3. That was great. Wow. Yeah, now you feel close to me, okay? So plus all the other speakers are jealous because they're like, wow, that guy's really funny, you know? In reality, I didn't say anything. So, well, listen, over the years of engaging on the topic of abortion, of talking to students on college campuses, of debating feminists and women's studies professors and other things like that, I've developed certain tactics that have helped me to be able to, let's just say, manipulate the conversation in such a way that I can help people be guided to the truth. Now, there might be some pushback when I said the word manipulative because it might sound to you like I'm doing something unjust, unfair, or immoral. And the truth of the matter is that's not the case at all. I simply mean that I'm applying basic logic, the basic logic that permeates all of modern conversation, that at least that should entail modern conversation, for the purpose of guiding people to the truth on the issue of abortion, okay? So I don't mean to suggest in any way that I'm doing some kind of a trick by some of these tactics. They're not tricks. They're just applying basic logic to the issue of abortion. And so what I've been asked to do is give you a sampling of these tactics. Now, several years ago, there was, I did a, let's say, all-day reunion for Camp Joshua, which is one of the student conferences that Oregon Right to Life leads. And in that conference, I presented in over about a 6-hour period these tactics. So what you're getting really is just sort of a bird's eye view, and then we're going to kind of be dipping down and picking up some of these tactics and trying to apply them in real-world sort of situations. So that's where we're headed with this material. Now, just to kind of get a sense for where you're at, I want you to just think about how you feel when you think about sharing your pro-life convictions with abortion choice advocates. Would you say that you're a number 1, I relish the encounter? Would you say 2, well, I'm willing, but sometimes I'm nervous, uncertain, or scared? Or 3, you would say you run the other way. You just want to avoid it. So raise your hand if you're number 1. You relish the encounter. Okay, there's a few of you. Raise your hand if you're number 2. You're willing. Okay, the vast majority. And raise your hand if you're number 3. You want to run the other way. Okay? And how many of you won't raise your hand no matter what I ask you? Okay, a few of you. All right, yeah. So now, just so you know, if I was to answer this question, I'm a number 2. Now, keep in mind, I get paid to go to secular universities and stand up in front of a university audience and present the pro-life view, and then take an hour to be willing to debate anybody in the audience for as long as they want to go. And then the next person gets up and does the same thing. Now, that might sound like, oh, wow, that sounds crazy. Who would want to do that? But yet, it turns out I don't relish the encounter. I'm nervous also. I get uncertain about what I'm going to say. Perhaps if somebody's going to present some challenge against me, how am I going to deal with it? So I want you to know that despite my fears as well, like the most of you, I'm still willing to able to do this. Not because I'm something special, but because I've adopted some tactics that help me to be able to navigate a lot of the conversations that arise. And most times that people present objections to the pro-life view, they are engaging in some what we call fallacy, a logical fallacy, which is a mistake in thinking. And that's what I want to present to you is some of the mistakes in thinking and some of the tactics that we can use to be able to present our case in a winsome and gracious way. The first tactic I'm just going to mention, but I'm not going to just talk about, is the importance of focusing the conversation that you have about abortion. Meaning, if you end up talking about abortion, the natural tendency for conversations is to tangent onto every other topic other than abortion itself. Meaning you start talking about abortion and naturally the conversation will go to rape and incest or choice and privacy or financial hardship or unwantedness or all these other topics. But if you continue to follow that conversation where it goes naturally, you'll end up talking about everything except for abortion itself. And so one of the things I talked about extensively in my previous breakout session was how to bring the conversation, wherever it is related to abortion, back to the one key question, which is, what is the unborn? Now, this isn't to shame you at all, but raise your hand if you were in this first session with me this morning. Okay, for those of you who are not, wait, keep your hands raised. For those of you who are not, find those people who are raising their hand now and talk to them afterwards. Get the notes or get my contact information. I'll be happy to send you that, because this is probably the most important thing that you can do, is focus on this question, because the entire abortion debate hinges on this question. And I explain why that's the case. So I would argue that's my most important tactic. But again, because I've already addressed it, I know it sounds unfair. I'm not going to address it here. Just find the persons that have been in that session or contact me. I'll give you my contact information at the end, and I'll be happy to pass on to you the importance of that key question. Now, the second tactic I want to teach you is called the Columbo tactic. Raise your hand if you saw the TV show Columbo. Okay, yeah. For those of you who are my age or older, probably you saw that. For those of you who are younger, perhaps you didn't. But one of the things that Lieutenant Columbo, played by Peter Falk, was really, really good at in that TV show was, does anybody remember what it was? What did he do consistently? Ask questions. That's right. He pestered people to death with questions. And the reason he did it is because questions are immensely powerful. They have the ability literally to guide a conversation in whatever direction you want it to go. And if you learn to use questions properly, you can do the same thing with any conversation, regardless of whether it's about abortion or anything else. And so the key to the Columbo tactic is to use questions instead of statements to be able to make your case and move forward in a conversation about the pro-life view. Now, I'm going to give you one specific kind of question, a Columbo question. And this particular question is about reversing the burden of proof. And I'm going to define what that looks like in just a second. But in order to do that, we have to first understand what an argument is. Because after all, we're dealing with the world of ideas. This is a battle of ideas. And so we are presenting an argument for our view, and they're going to be perhaps presenting an argument for their view. But we have to first understand what an argument is. Can somebody just kind of give me not a technical, but just a basic understanding of what an argument is? Anybody want to take a stab at that? How would you define an argument? And just as a clue, it's not entails bickering or anything like that. Yes? Okay, two people who are trying to make a point that's contrasting. I would actually say that you don't even need two people to make an argument. You just need one. But you got half of it, in which is they're trying to present a point of view. That's true. But just presenting a point of view is not sufficient for it to be an argument. What else is needed to make a point of view a bona fide argument? Yes? Convince the other person, but with what? What is needed to convince the person of the point of view? Yes? Not two separate ideas. What was that? Yes, supporting facts. That's right. So an argument is a claim or a point of view with supportive facts, with reasons to back it up. So when my wife says to me, well, Alan, where should we go to dinner tonight? Or what should we do for dinner? And I say, well, I think we should go to Taco Bell. Now, so far, I've just presented her with an opinion or my claim, my view. But I haven't given her an argument. And she says to me, why would we want to go to Taco Bell? What she's asking for is evidence or reasons to back up my claim. And so I say something like, well, because today's Tuesday and it's Taco Tuesday, you get 2 tacos for $1 or whatever it is, okay? Now at that point, I've just presented an argument. To say that my claim is we should go to Taco Bell, and my reasons for that, for thinking we should do that, is we get a deal. You know, there's a coupon or a deal, and so that's why we should go. That's all an argument is. My claim with reasons to back it up. Okay? So an argument is no more complex than that. It doesn't have to be mean-spirited. It doesn't have to be harsh. But that's what is the whole conversation about abortion about, is us presenting an argument and perhaps them presenting a counter-argument. Now, a lot of people liken arguments to a house. The roof is the claim. So in my previous example, saying we should go to Taco Bell would be my claim. But notice that a roof without walls to support it would just be a roof on the ground. That wouldn't be a house. In order to make it a house, you have to give the walls, the reasons why that claim is true. Okay? So, and that's, and my reasons were, well, we get two for one kind of thing. All right? That was my particular argument. Now, with that understanding of what an argument is, what is the burden of proof? Can anybody give me a definition of what the burden of proof looks like? Obviously, it's a legal term. You hear it in court cases a lot. But what is the burden of proof, really? It's related to this notion of an argument. Anybody want to take a stab at it? It has to do something with facts. If I was to accuse, I'm going to pick on David over here because I know David. If I was to accuse David of stealing my car and we were to go to a court, who would have the burden of proof to show something? Me or him? Me, that's right. Because I'm the one who's made the claim. I'm claiming he stole my car. So therefore, it's my responsibility to provide evidence for that claim. Now, if I walk in there to court and I don't present any evidence for my claim, who's going to win the case? He is, even if I have not made any kind of an argument. So the fact of the matter is the person who makes the claim bears the burden of proof. And the burden of proof is simply the responsibility that someone has to give evidence or reasons for their view. Okay? Now, and as I just mentioned, the way it works is the person who makes the claim bears the burden of proof. So if I claim that David has stolen my car, it's my job to bear the burden of proof. I have to give reasons for that. Now, if somebody comes to you, and again, I'm just going to give a kind of a Christian worldview example. If somebody comes to me and says, the Bible has been created by copying pagan myths. Who's made the claim? Me or them? Them. So who bears the burden of proof? They do, that's right. Now, if I say, well, I think God exists. Let's say we're in a conversation, I'm making a claim that God exists. Who's now made the claim? Who bears the burden of proof? I do, exactly. Now, having said that, here's the key point about this tactic. We, as a pro-life community, and for those of you who are also Christians, if you're not, that's fine, but those of you who are Christians, which I'm suspecting most of you are, we have a bad habit of giving people what I call free rides. And a free ride is this. Somebody makes a claim. They'll say, well, the Bible's been translated so many times, you can't possibly know what it says. You know, what the Apostle Paul wrote has been communicated accurately to us. They make a claim like that. And instead of us enforcing the burden of proof rule, what we do is we give them a free ride. We respond to a claim. We say, oh, that's not possibly true. You can't, of course we can know the Bible's been translated reliably. And we give this 5-minute discourse. Notice they have not produced an argument. All they've done is offer an opinion. And you've heard the phrase, everyone's got opinions, right? It doesn't mean they're true. And this is what a free ride is. We are making the task of evangelism or communicating the pro-life view harder than it needs to be because we feel that we have a burden of proof when no burden has been placed upon us. Most often, other people are making claims about either our Christian worldview or about the pro-life view that are just mere opinions. They're giving us a roof without walls and we're calling it a house. It's not. So instead of giving people a free ride, enforce the burden of proof and simply make them bear the burden rather than you taking the responsibility upon yourself to provide a defense against an opinion. Trust me, if I felt obligated to respond to every wacky and wild story that every atheist and pro-abortion advocate wants to offer me, I'd feel completely nervous about sharing my convictions with anybody. Because I feel like every time they say anything, I got to somehow respond to it. I don't. Make them give an argument first by asking them to give evidence or reasons for their view before you respond to it. And that is the principle behind this Columbo tactic. And the key question that you can ask to practice this rule is this. How did you come to that conclusion? Or why is basically what I'm asking them, or what I'm asking you to ask them. It doesn't have to be those exact words. Any question that asks them to give evidence, to give walls to their roof, will do. Now again, this is not inappropriate. If you made the claim that you think God exists, like everybody agreed here, you would recognize that we bear the burden of proof. So when they offer claims or opinions, don't assume there are argument unless it really is. Instead, ask, how did you come to that conclusion? And wait and listen. How much more easier is that than trying to give a defense, a 15, 20-minute, 5-minute, whatever it is, discourse as to why their opinion is wrong? Man, people think of the most wackiest things. The universe popped into existence by a bunch of mathematical swirling points that came and coalesced and formed a singularity, and bang, there's the universe. It's like, okay, nice story. Now give me any facts or reasons why I should think that's true. Okay? That's the response, not, oh, let me give a 10-minute explanation as to why that theory is mistaken. It's just an opinion. So let's take a look at some examples. Here's a common thing you've probably heard. Again, these are just examples, but people say the unborn is not a human being, but it's a potential human. Now, I've studied the issue of the pro-life view for many, many years. I've responded to this probably 1,000 times. I could give a 20-minute discussion and with PowerPoint and whatever explaining why this is false, but I don't. Instead, I enforce the burden of proof using the Columbo tactic. And I simply ask, why should I believe that? Or in this case, how did you come to that conclusion? Why should anybody believe that the unborn is a potential human, but not an actual human? What reason do you have for thinking that's true? And then sit back and listen. Don't help them out. And perhaps there'll be a strange silence because oftentimes they're used to pro-lifers jumping at that and responding with a 10-minute explanation, which stresses you out, right? It's not a baby, it's just part of my body. Really, do you have any evidence to back that up? What's easier to say? Do you have any evidence to back that up? Or is it easier to give a 10-minute explanation as to how the science of embryology proves that the unborn is actually a unique individual? Which is easier to say? How did you come to that conclusion, right? That's a lot easier to say. It just takes not even almost a second, perhaps. The other way takes 10 minutes. Now, if they give evidence for that, well, sure, you can respond to it. But initially, don't feel compelled to respond to that. It's not an argument. They've just offered you a roof without walls. Women will die in back alleys if abortion is made. Did I spell back alley? I spelled, ooh. Don't look at my spelling. Women will die in back alleys if abortion is made illegal. Again, what reasons do you have for thinking that's true? Okay. Now notice also what happens here. When you employ the Columbo tactic, you immediately take the pressure off of yourself. Oftentimes somebody will make a claim and we'll be like freaked out by it. Oh, what do we do? I don't know how to answer this. And by saying, well, how did you come to that conclusion? Now all of a sudden you're out of the hot seat and they're in the hot seat and they got to give an explanation. And they might give a 5-minute, 10-minute explanation as to why their view, what their view is or rationale. And that gives you some time to think about. All right, let me think about what they're saying. It gives you time, takes the pressure off of you. It gives you more material to work with. So there's all sorts of other benefits of asking this very appropriate question. Why? Anyways, keep that in mind with regards to people who are offering you roofs without walls. Okay? No more free rides. Now, a third tactic that I want to talk to you about is called narrating the debate. Now, how many have ever seen William Lane Craig or Bill Craig debate before on video or been in person? Not many of you, huh? William Lane Craig, Bill Craig? Just probably like 5 of you? Okay, 6. William Lane Craig is perhaps one of the top Christian debaters in the world. This is a man who goes to every country on the planet and perhaps debates the top atheist in that country and wins. He goes to Quebec, Canada, and debates the top atheist in French and then wins. All right? So Richard Dawkins, who's probably the most now famous atheist in the world, has refused to debate him and had to actually produce a piece in one of the leading newspapers in England explaining why he's not going to debate him. And he had to make up some story about how William Lane Craig defends God committing genocide in the Old Testament or something ridiculous like that. But the fact of the matter is, even other atheists have said you're a coward because you're afraid to debate William Lane Craig. Well, one of the things that William Lane Craig does very well is he narrates the debate. Now, I don't want you to be freaked out by the term debate. It's just this is a principle that's used in debates but can be used in everyday conversation. And here's what happens. When he was debating Christopher Hitchens, who recently passed away, but he was a very famous atheist, on the existence of God, he said this. William Lane Craig presented 5 arguments for God's existence. And then when it came turn for Christopher Hitchens to speak, he responded to only 2. And when it was William Lane Craig's turn to respond a second time, this is what he did. He said, audience, listen to what happened here. I presented 5 arguments for God's existence. Christopher Hitchens responded to only 2. Now, even if those 2 of those are correct, he still has not addressed my other 3, which, if the debate was to end at this point, my view that God exists, or that's the most reasonable understanding of how the universe came about, would still be the best explanation. And so what has Bill Craig done? He's kind of stood back and offered a third-person perspective of what's happening in the conversation or in the debate and posed it to be available to the rest of the audience. Okay? Now, even if there was no audience there, even if it was a one-on-one, he would still be presenting this kind of third-person, top-down perspective of what transpired. And this is very powerful because it helps people to see what's going on. Now, it can help you with what I call rapid-fire objectors. So oftentimes you're talking to somebody and you're presenting your pro-life view, and they pose a challenge to you. And you answer that challenge, you think sufficiently, and without them really addressing what you said, they pose another challenge. And then you kind of answer that, and they pose another challenge. And they just kind of keep on going and keep firing off objections at you. Now, what I do in this instance is I stop, I say, hold on a second, time out, and then I narrate the debate. I say, notice what's going on here. You presented an objection, I responded to that, and instead of kind of addressing what I said, you moved on to another topic and shifted the conversation. And then when I kind of addressed that, you immediately left that conversation and went on to another one. So let's first finish this kind of conversation, and then I'm happy to move on and talk about something else. And so what this does is it pauses the conversation instead of kind of jumping from topic to topic, and allows you to give a third-person sort of top-down perspective of what's transpiring for the purpose of making your conversation more constructive and productive. Right? Steamrollers, these are people, I'm sure you've met them, who they present with you an objection, you start to answer and explain, and in the first 5 words of your response, they interrupt you and talk over you. And you're like, oh, okay. And then finally, when they're done, you start answering again, and then all of a sudden they steamroll you again and talk over you again. And so again, narrating the debate helps. I say, oh, hold on a second. Oh, wait. Every time I try to answer your question, which by the way is a great question, you kind of interrupt me. So let me finish my response, and then I'll let you jump back in. Is that okay? So you kind of negotiate a deal in the process of narrating the debate. And this is why this tactic is so powerful. I can't tell you how many times people come up to me and say, Alan, what do I do though? I'm having a conversation, it's just kind of going back and forth, and then it's so hectic, or they're talking over me. This helps with that. This is what I do. When I'm standing on a college campus surrounded by 20 abortion choice advocates who are wanting to tear my head off, and they're all shouting at me, profanities, I mean, you can just imagine what. I use narrating the debate to help control it. Say, hold on a second, hold on. Everybody's got great ideas, one at a time here. I was talking to this gentleman here, Frank. Frank, go ahead, and then I'll be happy to address other people. So you kind of give this third-person perspective to allow people to see, oh, okay, yeah, that seems fair. We should allow this to kind of transpire this way. Okay? Very powerful, again, but very easy. Just pause the conversation, give a third-person perspective of what's going on. In the previous talk also, my previous breakout, I showed a video, because we had trained Kathy Ireland, who's a pro-life advocate, when she went on the TV show Hannity and Combs many years ago. And in this particular conversation, Alan Combs presented an argument, or not an argument, but he presented a view. He says, well, it's just a woman's body. And so Kathy Ireland presents a scientific defense for the claim that, no, the unborn is not just merely part of the mother's body. It's a unique individual. Yes, it's connected, but it's a unique individual. All right? Now, in response to that scientific defense, Alan Combs says, so you would deny a woman the right to choose. Now, does that in any way address what she just said? No, it completely ignores it. And this is, this is television, so of course that's going to happen. But this is what happens in everyday conversation as well. They present a challenge. You give a defense, perhaps a scientific defense that the unborn is a human being from the moment of conception or something like that. And instead of them responding to what you said, they shift the topic. Now, when you present your case, this is what needs to be done. And narrating the debate helps you to do this. They need to either respond to your defense or your case or your argument with counter evidence, or they need to concede the point that you made and factor it into their assessment of the unborn. In other words, if you say, oh, here's my case that the unborn is a human being, they can't then go on to some other thing. Oh, what about a woman's right to privacy? Okay, hold on a second, wait a minute. You need to either give counter evidence as to why my defense that the unborn is a human being from the moment of conception is mistaken, or you need to agree with me and say, yeah, it is a human being. Which is it? You can't just ignore what I said. But oftentimes as pro-lifers, we let that go away. We make an amazing defense for our view because after all the science and philosophy on the issue of abortion is on our side, right? So it's easy to make the case. So narrative debate will help you to address that. And you say, well, wait, hold on a second. You just asked me why I think the unborn is a human being. And then I presented a scientific defense that the unborn is a human being from the moment of conception. So am I wrong or am I right? What is it? If I'm wrong, give me the evidence as to why I'm wrong. If I'm right, then you need to acknowledge that, and then we can move on, because perhaps the unborn being a human being will play a role in the rest of our conversation. Instead, we let that go away. We let them go off on a tangential issue, and we never make any progress. And then people say, well, no one changes people's minds on abortion. Well, it's because we're oftentimes making this mistake. So that is narrating the debate. Let's go to another tactic that I use. Taking the roof off. This is based on a logical principle known as reductio ad absurdum. Can anybody tell me what that means? What is reductio ad absurdum? Yeah?
Reduction to the absurd.
Yes, reduction to the absurd. Okay? So this is a tactic that I use quite frequently, in fact, that capitalizes on the fact that a lot of people's views, and for that matter, views in general, oftentimes lead to absurd conclusions. Now, let me show you the steps of this tactic. And by the way, all of you already know this tactic, and I'll prove it to you in just a minute. But all of you already know this tactic, so don't be freaked out by these 3 steps. Here's how the tactic works. You're talking to somebody, and they present an argument or a view. And here's what I do. You first accept and adopt the person's view for the sake of argument. And then, and here's the key step, then you take their view for what's called a test drive. You see, well, if I accept what they're saying, what logically follows from that view? In other words, if I accept their logic and rationale and I apply it to something else, will it lead to some absurd conclusion? If so, then the logic that leads to that absurd conclusion is also absurd, and it can be rejected. And so your third step then is to ask a question that, and here's the key point, graciously exposes the absurdity of that view. Do you have a quick question or a clarification? Or?
I was just wondering, but different people will have different perceptions of what is logical and what isn't.
Different people will have different perceptions of what is logical and what isn't. That's true, but it doesn't mean that all perceptions are correct. So you would have to, I mean, obviously, these tactics, the whole point of these tactics is to show that their perceptions, if they think that their view is logical, perhaps is not. So that's the whole point of this view, is to help people understand what perceptions are accurate and what are not. But I italicize here the word graciously because as a Christian myself, what 2 Corinthians 5:20 says, we are all ambassadors for Christ as though God were making his appeal through us, which means we represent Jesus Christ in our endeavor, and if we're pro-lifers as well, we represent the pro-life view as well by the very fact that we're talking about it. And so how people view us is a reflection upon what we represent. And so if you're a Christian and you're coming across as a jerk or condescending or harsh, then that's what people are going to conclude about Jesus himself. So that's why I say we're not trying to bully people or make them feel stupid or be condescending. Okay, and that's why you got to ask a question graciously that exposes the absurdity of their view, not intentionally making them feel stupid. Because if that's what you do every time, because you just get a kick out of it, well then you're not being a winsome ambassador. So keep that in mind. But that's why I have graciously italicized there. Okay, now in case you're thinking I don't get this tactic, let me prove to you that you do. Imagine this hypothetical situation. A father is disappointed that his daughter has started to smoke. And so he comes to her and says, honey, why did you start smoking? And she says to him, well, because all my friends were doing it. What's the father going to say? Yeah, I didn't understand a word anyone said, but that's okay. I know what you said, because I know you know how to respond to that. And that is, yeah, if all your friends jumped off a cliff, would you do that too? Or off a bridge, yeah. Now, this is simply taking the roof off. This is reductio ad absurdum. And listen to what the father's done. Remember the first stage, or the first step of the tactic is to adopt the person's view just for the sake of argument. So he said, okay, what's my daughter's view? It's, if my friends are doing it, I'm going to do it as well. Okay, let's take that for a test drive, that view. Now, let's apply that to jumping off a bridge. If her friends jumped off a bridge, then she would do that too. Well, that's absurd. That's right. And so is the logic that led to that absurd conclusion. Okay? So since it leads to an absurdity, that's why we reject the logic that led to the absurdity. And that is simply taking the roof off. And that's what the father does at the very end. He asks a question that graciously exposes the absurdity of that logic. Jesus himself actually did this back in Matthew 12, where people say, well, you must be casting out demons in the power of Beelzebub. And he says that's impossible, because if that's the case, then Satan's casting out Satan, and he's divided against himself, which would mean that the kingdom of darkness would not stand. But it is standing, so that's absurd. Therefore, so is the Pharisees' logic. And Jesus just simply went to our website and saw this tactic and used it with it. I'm just kidding. He didn't do that. Peter did that, not Jesus. No. But you see, again, it's just a basic concept in logic. Okay, I'm not creating anything new by doing this. I'm just recognizing this is the way logic works. So, with that understood, let's take a look at some common statements that are made that can be shown to be absurd. So, for example, you probably saw this either as a bumper sticker or perhaps even had people say this to you. Don't like abortion? Well, don't have one. Okay. Now, the first step in taking the roof off tactic is to identify the logic that's being expressed here. And that is, if you don't like something, then just don't partake in it or just don't do it. Now, let's apply that logic to something else and see if it leads to an absurd conclusion. Perhaps a historical thing like slavery, all right? Would it have made any sense for a Southerner to say to a Northern person during the Civil War, say, well, if you don't like slavery, don't own a slave. I mean, wouldn't that not come across as very convincing? Because what they were saying is not that we don't like slavery as if we don't like, peanut butter chocolate ice cream, which would be crazy if you didn't like that, by the way. That's the best ice cream. Haagen-Dazs especially makes a really good version of that. It's expensive, but actually sometimes I'm getting off this. I really like chocolate and peanut butter. It's like the greatest thing in the world. But that just shows the ridiculous. We're not saying we don't like abortion as if we don't like a flavor of ice cream. We're saying we think abortion is objectively, morally reprehensible. And in the same way, it wouldn't have made any sense to a person who's opposed to slavery for somebody to tell them, well, you don't like slavery? Don't own a slave. It makes no sense. Or how about a modern day example? People might say, well, if you don't like human trafficking, that's fine. Just don't traffic humans. No, we're saying that human trafficking itself is objectively immoral, and that's why we're opposed to it. And so, again, it shows the absurdity, that kind of question shows the absurdity of the view. And if that leads to this absurd conclusion, that means the logic that led to that absurd conclusion is also absurd and can be rejected. And therefore, that's why we'd reject that particular case. Well, here's another one. I was talking to, I don't know if it was when David was at Camp Joshua, but a few years ago we were out on the streets of Portland approaching people, just kind of walking on the street and engaging them on conversations about abortion. And there happened to be a Planned Parenthood employee, and so I went up and started a conversation with her. And this was the first thing she said, basically, unless you're willing to adopt all the babies that might have been born had abortion not taken place, you have no right to oppose abortion. And again, the logic here, let's just accept their logic for the moment. And that is, okay, unless I somehow fix the consequences that result from a certain decision I make, therefore, if I don't do that, then I can't oppose that particular thing. So again, you could take a historical example like slavery. Would it make any sense for somebody to say to a person who was opposed to slavery during the Civil War, say, well, hey, look, unless you're willing to hire all of my ex-slaves that are freed from the abolition of slavery, you have no right to oppose slavery. No, that has nothing to do with it. I could be opposed to slavery and not willing to take all these slaves on to my own, hire them. But it's a non sequitur. It doesn't follow. Okay, I'm not obligated to care for all of these people just because I think that slavery is wrong. And you're not justified in engaging in an immoral act simply because I'm not willing to care for the consequences that result from outlawing it. And the same thing could happen in maybe a more modern day example. I might say to somebody, well, unless you're willing to adopt my daughter or all my daughters, you have no right to oppose me abusing them. Now, does that make any sense? That's absurd. How does someone's unwillingness or your unwillingness to adopt all of my daughters give me the right to abuse them? It doesn't. It's not connected. That's absurd. That's right. And so is the rationale that led to that absurd conclusion. And so that's why you want to ask a question that exposes the absurdity of these views. And that shows that the logic inherent in this kind of statement is, again, absurd as well. I'm personally against abortion, but I don't think we should make it illegal. This is a favorite of many politicians. In fact, many Christians I run into even will say this to me. And I use a different approach to responding to this. I call it the modified pro-choice position. And here's how I take the roof off in this particular example. When somebody says this to me, I just ask them a simple question. Why are you personally opposed to abortion? And 99 out of 100 times I get the same exact answer. And that is, well, I'm personally opposed to abortion because I think, abortion kills an innocent baby. And I say, okay, let me replay back to you then what you just told me. You personally think that abortion kills babies, but you don't want to make it illegal to kill babies? Like, well, when you put it that way, it doesn't sound so good. I'm like, that's your view. If I miscommunicated it, that's fine, but is that not what you're telling me? And I'm not kidding. I'm not saying this to say that I'm wonderful. I have people literally change their mind and say, yeah, you know what, it doesn't make any sense. You're right, I should be willing to try to make it illegal or do what I can to be against that. So again, all I did was take the roof off. I showed the absurdity of their view, right? Nobody would say, well, I'm personally against slavery, but I think it's okay if other people own slaves. I don't want to force my views into the people. That's absurd. That's right. And so is the logic that leads to that absurdity. And that's why it's mistaken. You can take the roof off. Reductio ad absurdum. Let's go to another tactic, sticks and stones. This is a tactic that helps you deal in situations where, well, actually, before I tell you what it is, what is an ad hominem attack? There's another Latin word. It sounds really complex, but we got a Latin expert right here. Yes, go ahead.
The man. You're attacking the man instead of the argument.
That's right, to the man. Do you study Latin? Or she does, okay. So yeah, to the man. Ad hominem literally means to the man. So when you attack a person's view, when you attack a person or their character, or they call you a name, we would consider this an ad hominem attack. Now you might be thinking, Alan, do people actually still call you names? I mean, I can imagine when you were in elementary school at recess, you were called, dweeb and dork and loser. And, yeah, I did get that. And you might be thinking, do people as adults actually still call you names? And the answer is, oh, yes, they do. They just use more sophisticated terms to mask the fact that they're actually calling me a name. But in actuality, they still do. Now, here's kind of to graph out what this particular mistake in thinking looks like, is this. Normally, if you're having a conversation with somebody and you've presented an argument, their attack or their critique or their counter evidence should be directed at your argument. That's the direction that their attack should be leveled at your argument. Instead, in an ad hominem fallacy or an ad hominem attack, instead of attacking your argument, they attack you or your character. Okay? And when this occurs in a formal debate, if the debate opponent was to point this out, this is embarrassing. Because you're just basically calling them a name. Your mother is ugly and she dresses you funny. That wouldn't go over very well in a formal debate. But that's in essence what they're doing if they call you a name. And again, they don't say those words, but in essence they're doing the same exact thing when they call you names. Socrates used to point out that this occurred. He said, when the debate is lost, slander becomes the tool of the loser. And this truly is the case. Oftentimes when people start to realize they're not making any headway with you because you got the moral high ground, you got the scientific high ground, you got the philosophical high ground, they'll resort to calling you names. Okay? If you're talking about the issue of homosexuality, you're probably familiar with the terms homophobic, narrow-minded, bigoted, whatever. These are all things that I'm called routinely, even if I'm making a cogent argument. Okay? Albert Hubbard, who's a philosopher and American writer, said this: if you can't answer a man's arguments, all is not lost. You can still call him vile names, And again, that's precisely what he's illustrating, is this fact that eventually when people start to realize they're losing, they start resorting to name calling. And so this particular tactic is helpful because that's what it does. It helps to expose name calling for what it is, and that is a childish attack. And it shows basically that attacking a person's character or themselves is not legitimate. And so here's how I deal with it. When someone calls me a name, I simply ask them to define the term they just used. Now I'll have homophobic, intolerant, narrow-minded, bigoted, anti-woman. All these are just name calling. They are not arguments. Okay, and so if somebody calls you a name, I simply ask them for a definition. Now here's what's going to happen. By forcing them to give a definition, it's going to be awkward. But also, the definition either will, if it does apply to you, it probably also applies to them. Or, in some way, or it doesn't matter that it applies to you. And let me give you an example of both of these. Sometimes people will say, you think women who abort are wrong? How can you be so judgmental or narrow-minded or intolerant? Okay? Now, again, that sounds really sophisticated and like, oh man, they got me now. I'm intolerant. I'm judgmental. But in reality, judgmental, narrow-minded, and intolerant is simply name-calling. And to demonstrate that, I just simply say, okay, could you tell me what you mean by, could you define for me intolerant or judgmental? And they'll say, well, you're just kind of like sitting there and pointing at somebody and saying that what they're doing is wrong. Now, okay, maybe, but guess what they're doing? They're pointing at me and saying that I'm wrong for making a moral assessment about abortion. So they're actually also judgmental based on that very definition. Same thing with narrow-minded. I'll say, well, could you define for me narrow-minded? They say, well, yeah, you think you're right, and any view that departs from your view, you think is wrong. It's okay. Do you think you're right? Yes. Well, my view departs from your view, right? Yes. So then you think I'm wrong, correct? Yes. Well, by that definition, you're intolerant also. You're narrow-minded, right? Again, if it applies to you, most likely it also applies to them. But you know, sometimes it doesn't matter that it applies. In fact, one time I was speaking at Central Michigan University. It's a secular university in kind of central Michigan, go figure. Hence the name Central Michigan University. I like to point out the obvious, but no. So I was asked to present the pro-life position to the university audience. And so they gave me, I think, 20 minutes to present kind of a scientific defense for the pro-life view. And then after that, as I often do, I let people get up to a microphone and and to debate me, and they can debate on any part of my presentation they like on the issue of abortion. So this went on for about an hour, and after a while, people started to realize, again, the debate was lost in a sense. And again, I don't give you these examples to say, oh, look at Alan. I'm trying to say this because I want you to know and be confident that we have all the evidence on our side, scientifically, philosophically, biblically as well. So I just want you to be of good cheer for that reason. But anyways, after a while, they realized this wasn't working. And so finally, somebody gets up to the microphone and just says to me, well, you're anti-woman. And here's an example of when it doesn't really matter if it applies to you. And so I said to them, well, you know what? Let's just say you're right. Now, keep in mind, about 40 minutes before, I had presented a scientific defense that the unborn is a human being from the moment of conception. So I said to them, let's say you're right, I'm anti-woman. How does that change the scientific defense that I just gave that the unborn is a human being? What if I was an anti-woman and a homophobe? How would that affect the merits of this case? It wouldn't. Who I am has no bearing on the validity of the argument I just presented. I could be a Nazi, homophobic, narrow-minded, intolerant bigot who's a racist as well. I could be every bad thing. I could not know how to add math, do math. It wouldn't matter because my character has no bearing on the merits of this view. This argument stands or falls on its own merits, irrespective of how much of a jerk I am. So in that sense, when you ask them to give a definition, it just shows it doesn't matter. Because we're making a scientific defense or a philosophical defense or whatever, biblical defense for our view. And if you are anti-woman or a homophobe or whatever, in some sense, it doesn't matter. Now, I'm not saying I am, but I'm just saying it doesn't matter because, after all, they're just kind of name-calling. Many of you may have seen this billboard. 77% of anti-abortion leaders are men. 100% of them will never get pregnant. What is the ad hominem attack in this particular example? Can anybody tell me? What's that?
That men can't get pregnant.
Yeah, that men can't get pregnant. It's basically an argument directed at the gender of the pro-life advocate. Basically because, sorry to be frank, because you have a penis, you can't speak on this issue. That's really what they're saying. Right. It sounds ridiculous, but that's in essence what they're saying. Men shouldn't say anything about abortion. And so, you could respond to different ways to this one. You could perhaps take the roof off, but actually sometimes, I do like to take the roof off. I say, okay, so men shouldn't say anything about abortion. So by that logic, when men molest little boys, I guess women shouldn't have anything to say about that either. Well, that's ridiculous. That's absurd. That's right. It's because that view is absurd. Or perhaps I might say, well, so if men shouldn't say anything about abortion, then perhaps we should just ignore Roe v. Wade since it was decided all by male judges. Yeah. Would you like that? No, of course not, right? So that just shows, again, the illogic of their view. It shows the absurdity of their view, and therefore you can reject the rationale that led to it as well. So let me just give you these final thoughts of kind of encouragement. Listen, one of the things that has helped me to do this more effectively each year is I practice. And I live in Oceanside, California, which is right next to a Marine Corps base. And a lot of the Marines will often have this phrase. They say, look, the more you sweat in training, the less you bleed in battle. Which is basically this idea that, look, you practice, you role play with friends, you talk, you do these things, you got to say them out loud. You have to say these tactics out loud. Make your lips flap and your tongue go up and down. And when you do that, you'll learn them far better than if you just sit here and listen to them and never say them again. Practice and role play with friendly community, and then go out and do it with the real thing, and you get better. And you'll have less wounds when you go out and do it in the real world if you practice first. 2, don't be discouraged by outward appearances. Look, I know oftentimes you walk away and say, man, I didn't do anything. I didn't achieve anything. They didn't change their mind. You don't know that. Oftentimes, in fact, most times when people have said, yeah, I changed my mind, they said, it wasn't when you presented this view or something and I was at the university audience or something. It wasn't then that I changed my mind. But the images that you showed of abortion, or perhaps the things you said, I went home and 2 weeks later, in the quietness of my own mind and heart, I was thinking about what you're saying, and the force of what you said finally really hit me. And that's when I really became pro-life. So oftentimes people change their minds well after the fact that you do kind of you make your case. And oftentimes you got to make your goal a little bit more modest. Don't feel committed to converting them entirely at that moment, at that particular point. Make your goal just to put a stone in their shoe. Oftentimes, you get a pebble in your shoe, and every time you walk, you're kind of reminded by that pebble in your shoe. That's what you want to do. You want to give people something to think about. So they walk away, and that idea or concept that you presented, perhaps an image of the unborn, or perhaps the image of abortion, or whatever it might be, is just pestering them in their mind. And that's something that I would argue that God can use to change their minds. I like I'm not Catholic, but I really appreciate what Mother Teresa says. She says, look, God has not called me to be successful. He called me to be faithful. This is exactly true. As ambassadors for Jesus Christ, or the pro-life movement, we are called not to convert people or change people's minds. We're called simply to be faithful to the message. If you make that your goal and do the best darn job you can do at communicating your views and your convictions in a persuasive and compelling, yet winsome and gracious manner, you are a success in that sense, even if the people reject you. Okay? Keep that in mind. Thank you for your time.